In 2005, 23-year-old man by the name of Levi King went on a vicious, inexplicable 24-hour killing spree. He started his murdering binge in rural Pineville, Missouri, where he killed an elderly man and his daughter-in-law and then stole their pickup and headed for Texas. He ended up in El Paso, crossed the border into Mexico, and then for some reason came back across the border and then tried to cross again. He was then found with a gun in his car and he was arrested. He was later tried for the murders and convicted. But in between the time he left Missouri, where he killed the elderly man and the daughter-in-law, and him winding up in El Paso, crossing over into Mexico, he made a stop in Pampa, Texas. He found the house he decided to break into. He kicked in the back door, and the first thing he did was to shoot the homeowner, Brian Conrad, 3 times. He then put 2 bullets in Molly, their dog, and then 5 bullets in Conrad's 35-year-old pregnant wife, Michelle. The killer then walked into the second bedroom where 10-year-old Robin Doan lay on her bed. Robin had actually seen the intruder come in, and she hid from his sight and then ran into her bedroom. King walked into her bedroom, stood at the door, saw her, fired 1 bullet. It missed her and went into the pillow. She lay there as if she had been shot, and he went on. Before rummaging around in their kitchen and finding something to eat, he went to the 3rd bedroom. And there he found 14-year-old boy and killed him as well. The thing is, Pam and I were in Pampa when all this took place. The Doan family, Conrad family, Doan family, did not go to our church, but the 14-year-old boy, Zach's best friend, did go to our church. We'll call him Stephen. A few days after this horrific event took place, by the way, Robin, who was 10 at the time, the only survivor, you can watch her story. She's been on 2020 and all kinds of news shows that have done a story about her. She's an amazing young lady. But 14-year-old Zach was killed in his bedroom that night. And his best friend, everybody was broken up in a town of 15,000, you can imagine. But this little boy was broken. His mama brought him to my office at First Baptist Church in Pampa. And as she started telling me the story, the little boy started crying then. 13 years old, 14 years old, and he was sobbing uncontrollably. The problem was this. The little boy, again, was best friends with the boy Zach who had been killed. And he told me, he said, every time I close my eyes, I see Zach being shot and him falling down dead. And so he didn't sleep. He wouldn't close his eyes. And so he had been up for days now. He is exhausted. His emotions are raw. He crying uncontrollably, but he will not close his eyes because he sees in his mind his best friend falling down dead. We talked for a little while, and I said, here's what we need to do, Stephen. We need to complete the scene. Every time you close your eyes, you see your best friend falling down dead. Go ahead and walk through that. But realize that's not the end of the story. As you see your best friend falling down dead, also see an angel of God. In the moment called the twinkling of an eye, that angel of God lifted Zach up and took him into the kingdom of heaven. This is a story that helps us understand what takes place in our lives and how we need to view the people around us and our future. I'm talking about hope. Today I am finishing the series on the multiple sermons on new wineskins. And next week I'm starting a brand new series I'm calling Holiness, WHOLINESS. And we're going to talk about spiritual strongholds. But when we talk about new wineskins and what Jesus brought into the culture, into the world at that time, you can't argue that he brought hope. That is the one thing that he brought, is hope. That is what the little boy Stephen needed to see. That is what we need to see. We need to hear him speak hope into our lives. Now, science has proven, multiple studies, that humanity cannot exist without hope. Without a belief that there is something good tomorrow. In his book, Dying of Despair, Aaron Chiardi, a psychiatrist, makes a pointed conclusion to all of his research. He says this. He said over a 10-year span when he's been studying this, it turns out, he says, that the one factor most strongly predictive of suicide, the one factor is not how sick the person is. It's not how many symptoms he exhibits. It's not even how much physical pain he is in or whether he is rich or poor. That the primary and most dangerous factor is a person's sense of hopelessness. Life lived without tomorrow. If anything, Jesus brought hope to this world. To address this issue, I want to read a familiar passage, Matthew 14, verses 28 through 33. And I want to share this with you. You may think it an odd passage to address hope, but I want you to stay with me because we see something in this story that hopefully will help you. So turn with me to Matthew 14 and follow as I read verses 28 through 33. Matthew 14, 28 through 33. Then Jesus called to him, Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water. Yes, come, Jesus said. Now, again, the scene that we're talking about is the Sea of Galilee. The setting is the Sea of Galilee. Jesus, they've just fed the 5,000. Sea of Galilee, Jesus goes into the mountains to rest, and the disciples then get on the Sea of Galilee and they begin fishing. And we're told that they fished all night long. And during their all-night fishing time, a storm breaks out. We're told that the disciples were truly frightened. But what scared them was not so much the storm, but what they saw coming toward them. A figure. They thought at first it was a ghost. But then he spoke to them and said, "Don't be afraid. Take courage. I am here." As they see Jesus coming toward them, Peter said, "Lord, if it's really you, call to me and let me come to you." And Jesus said, "Yes, come." And so Peter was out of the boat, into the wind, and onto the water. There are two things I want us to see in this story. The first is when faith turns to fear. You've not experienced that, have you? When you reach out, you stand in hope, and all of a sudden, you start quaking on the inside. Peter, what he did showed great courage. He asked Jesus, "May I come to you? May I walk to you? May I do what you're doing?" And Jesus said, "Yes." But what I'd like for us to see is in verse 30 of Matthew 14, that when Peter saw the strong wind and waves, he was terrified and began to sink. The word terrified here is the Greek word phobos, Phobos. It's where we get our English word phobia. Fear, irrational fear. This term, phobos, identifies all kinds of fears. In fact, it's used commonly in the New Testament. It's used to describe someone's fear of death. It's also used to describe the fear you and I would feel if an angel appeared to us. It's the fear that people feel when they think that the end of the world is coming. The term is used in all of those settings and situations, and so it's a common term in the Bible to identify, in effect, any fear. All fear. Rational fear, logical fear, irrational fear. Phobos. Peter was terrified when he saw the wind and the storm. We let the scene play out, and we see what fear can do to faith. Again, it's obvious that Peter showed great faith as he climbed out of the boat and stepped on the water and began to walk. But one sign from the storm, one blowing of the wind, and Peter's faith flees and fear steps in. We've all been there. Maybe you've not walked on water, but there have been times when you've stood in faith. There have been times when you've taken the hand of God and you have known that God was going to see you through. You take a faith stand, determined that you're going to trust God with your pain, with your problems, with your sorrow. You determine you're going to get out of the boat and trust Him and walk to Him as He calls you. We bail out of the boat of safety, and into the wobbly world of faith. Can you imagine the scene there on the Sea of Galilee? Peter, they see Jesus walking. Jesus tells Peter to come. He throws one leg over the boat, the side of the boat, and hanging on for dear life, he throws the other leg over, and he begins to touch the water. And he finds that miraculously it supports him. And so he lets himself down slowly, getting a footing in the water, showing uncommon faith and spiritual courage. Peter walks away from the boat, taking a few unsteady steps of faith as he walks to Jesus, but only one reminder of the storm. And Peter gets distracted. He diverts his attention. He loses his focus. Phobos sets in. Fear sets in. And he begins to sink. Again, we've been there, wanting to be faithful, wanting to walk with God, desiring to honor Him in our lives. You've heard Him call you out of the boat before. You've stepped out, let go of control that you think you have in your life, and you release to Him the burden that you've clung to. As you meet Him in the waters of faith, you determine you're going to trust God. You're going to determine you're going to walk with Him. You take this leap of faith, root yourself out of the boat, and you begin to walk a life of faith. You take the first steps with trepidation on this cold, dark sea of faith. Jesus is standing near. You hear His voice urging you on. You feel His presence drawing you. There's joy in your heart as you get your faith legs under you. And as you begin your journey, the storm begins to rise. You feel the wind. You hear the rumble. And fear can dominate. We panic. We don't mean to. We don't want to. But the storm creates phobos. One person has said, just as the Bible declares that perfect love casts out fear, it's also true that perfect fear casts out faith. What we see in Peter is when faith turns to fear. But there's a second point, and that is when fear cries out for hope. The little boy, Stephen, in my first story, He couldn't put this together in his mind. The only thing that needed to happen was for him to complete the story. That's what we do with this point. We complete this story, and it brings hope. Peter did one thing that turned everything around. Now remember, he's sinking. All right? Phobos has filled his heart. It's diverted his attention. He's lost his focus on where he's going. The winds swirl around him. He turns and his attention is on what's happening in his immediate circumstance, and he begins to sink. Nobody has to tell us when we're sinking. We know when we're sinking. And it hurts. We started out in faith. We are sinking in fear. But the next step, where Peter cries out, Lord, save me. Lord, help me. If fear has dominated your life, if fear has dominated your faith, know that you can complete this story. If you are here this morning and fear about tomorrow, fear about finances, fear about health, fear about death, fear about COVID, fear will stop faith in its tracks. But when that happens, not if, when that happens in our lives, we complete the story. As we're sinking, we cry out for help, for hope. And Jesus reached down, pulled him up, said, Peter, why don't you trust me more? Got him in the boat. The storm ceased. And the disciples looked at each other and said, wow. Wow. He really is who he says he is. God never intended us to live without hope. That is why we talk about heaven. That is why we have faith and trust that whatever is going on in my today, that my tomorrow is going to be good. Therefore, get out of the boat. Some of you have been sitting in that blooming boat till you got blisters on your backside. Get out of the boat. John mentioned earlier that we're putting together a whole new ministry concept, and we're putting the pieces into place, and we're going to be moving forward. And here's the thing, you're going to be needed in this. You have a role, you have a place. I promise you, we're going to need you. In some area, at some level, we're going to need you. And you're going to have to get out of the boat. Step out in faith. Your first few steps may be shaky, but you'll find your faith legs. And you may fail. But when fear cancels faith, then we cry out in hope. Complete the picture. Stop letting fear dominate. And in your trouble, cry out for hope.